Howdy folks, welcome to this third video in my Books of Simon Stahlenhag series, as we explore some of the themes and politics of Stahlenhag's excellent The Electric State. In their first two books, Tales from the Loop and Things from the Flood, Stahlenhag introduced us to an alternate version of Sweden, one where technological developments led to magnetrine skyships, interplanetary teleportation and sentient teddy bears, all dressed in the nostalgia of the 80s and 90s. These books were presented as a collection of fictional childhood memories, offering a series of first-hand recollections that tread the line between memoir and fantasy, with us always having to question what is fact and what is a hazy and fanciful childhood memory. The artworks of Stahlenhag were certainly the main attraction, with their sweeping vistas of the Swedish countryside decorated with the dissonance of impossible mechanical marvels, but the accompanying text added a contextual flavour, placing the artwork within the world that the author created. In this way, we were taken on a journey that required some thought and observation in order to build our understanding of the history and politics in this setting, with Stahlenhag keen to remind us that the primary focus of these recollections was the coming of age of our main character. Whilst there were narratives and recurring themes and storylines, the focus was always on each element in isolation, whether it be the persecuted sentient robots of the Vagabonds, the sightings of dinosaurs roaming the Swedish countryside, or the slapstick disasters of failed entrepreneur Gordon Frisk. Amidst the nostalgic 80s and 90s warmth, there was however a dark sadness too, with young deaths featuring quite often, as well as trauma, poverty, abuse, genocide and alienation. But wait, why am I mentioning all this? Isn't this all covered already in the other videos? Well yes, but I mention it simply because The Electric State is a very different animal. It is a darker, grittier, and much more narratively driven book, with a story that runs from start to finish, and a much more explicit sense of danger as we follow the teenage Michelle and her mechanical companion Skip, navigating the dangers of a collapsing USA. But before we get into the pages of The Electric State, let me just remind you of how these videos work. This is an exploration of the book that ignores all other materials, analysis and opinion in an attempt to communicate what I have gleaned from my reading of the book and nothing else. This will likely mean I will conclude things not intended by the author, that I might misinterpret their intent, and that my views may not agree with others that have also read this book. However, this is the fun of this sort of exercise. It is ultimately nothing more than a personal interpretation of a piece of art, so try not to take it too seriously. Also, obviously, spoiler warnings from here on out, as we will be talking about any and all content from the book. Without further ado then, let us take our first steps into a riven and dying United States as we follow our protagonist on their journey through the Electric State.
Lighthouse keepers were once warned they shouldn't listen to the sea for too long. Likewise, you could hear voices in the static and lose your mind. It was as if there were a code in there, a code that could, as soon as your mind detected it, irrevocably conjure demons from the depths.
The setting of The Electric State is an alternate United States around the beginning of the 21st century, a nation which has suffered through some kind of civil war that has physically damaged the country to such an extent that vast parts of the country are now a virtually unlivable desert. Whatever the dynamics of this war, the United States appeared to have come out of it without changing that most fundamental aspect of US political culture, the pseudo-worship of capital. It is still very much at the forefront of their national identity. However, the trauma of a domestic war and the fallout from the methods used to win it have left a visible scar on the American psyche and a void at the heart of its people. This was a void that the market was only too happy to fill. Early on in the book, we are treated to an advert for Mode 6, the latest generation of a sort of advanced virtual reality headset that taps directly into your mind in a way that allows for a much more intense and intimate connection between mind and machine. We hear references throughout the book that it was this technology that allowed the Federals to win the war, using huge mechanical drones piloted by human minds remotely, and the company that makes these headsets, Center, even declares on a billboard, "Winning design awards and wars." We learn very early on in the book that there were side effects to consistent use of these headsets, with federal pilots reportedly experiencing stillborn pregnancies during their service. The collateral damage was of two kinds: the civilians unfortunate enough to be caught in the crossfire, and the children of the federal pilots who, as a concession to the godheads of defence technology, were all stillborn. We also hear from our main protagonist in this story, the teenage Michelle, that their mother experienced a number of traumas from their service in the military using these headsets. Once upon a time, these kinds of ships had been the pride of the Federal Army. Behold the Amphion, the pride of the Air Force. 10 million tons of rust and bird shit. It was the neuronics in the Amphion ships that had burned out my mother's mind, so I guess it was fitting in a way. The cost of using this technology to defeat the nation's enemies was clearly borne by those at the bottom of the ladder. A familiar sentiment, I'm sure. But how then was this technology, with all of its flaws and dangerous implications, commodified into a product for general sale? I mean, that one's an easy one to answer, isn't it? It offered not only a profitable new market, but also a new media channel with which to allow influence from those with power over those that don't. We only have to consider the way that many private enterprises are running headlong towards AI to understand how much caution and morality are sublimated to the pursuit of growth and profit. At the point we join the story, the war, its environmental impact, and the launch of Mode 6 are all very much in the rearview mirror. Instead, the period we're about to experience is very much about the aftermath of these events, and so it is that the first time we see a Mode 6 in use is, well, in fact, Michelle and their mechanical companion Skip are pretty much the only life we see for quite some time. We do see many people wearing Mode 6 headsets, however, it's just that they are mostly dead, or at the very least dead-ish. It transpires that the Mode 6 release was a revelation that captured what would appear to be the majority of the population, and what started out as a media phenomenon instead became something of a national obsession. The seemingly addictive properties of the headset tap into some deep-rooted desire, as we come across many people who clearly died wearing the headset, neglecting their physical bodies and allowing themselves to literally waste away whilst connected. He was toothless and bearded and gasped for breath underneath his neurocaster. His body was emaciated and shriveled, and the place reeked. A tube in his arm snaked around an IV stand to a huge tank in the ceiling that had once been full of something yellow and gooey. The old man was completely incapacitated, and it was impossible to say how long he had been there. This wave of neurocaster addiction appears to have spread over the last few years, with the protagonist telling us of how their foster parents both succumbed to its infectious warmth, forgetting their earthly responsibilities and giving themselves over to it entirely. You can chart their descent into pure addiction across the recollections of the story, starting with this. It was after the big update of 1996 that things got weird. Mode 6. After that, they rarely watched TV anymore. The house was quieter. I remember that sometimes when Amanda and I came home from school, Ted and Bridget were still on the couch in the living room with their neurocasters on. Things seemingly continued to deteriorate, as the next update later in the book was decidedly more tragic. I turned the lights on and stood by the edge of the pool, looking down into the water. Bridget was on the bottom, her waterlogged body heavy like a marble statue against the tiles, the LEDs on her neurocaster still burning like glowing embers. There was something going on with her mouth. It moved like the mouth of someone dreaming, and it didn't stop moving until later, when Ted took the neurocaster off, and she finally died. This delayed reaction to death is something that comes up a number of times in the book, with people that should be very much dead somehow persisting with the assistance of the neurocaster. It seems able to effectively prioritise the preservation of brain function at the cost of the physical body, which seems a dangerous functionality to give to a technology. We will talk some more about why that is important later on, but for now it is enough to know that it's a recurring feature and is indicative of the power Mode 6 had over the human brain. This power is perhaps even more evident after we learn a bit more about the foster mother's death after the removal of the neurocaster, which is explained in some more detail later in the book. Birgit's eyes had been greyish, looking for something that had been pulled away. How long had she been there at the bottom of the pool? Hours? She had vomited all of the water from her body onto the couch, and then she had curled up, lifeless. Ted sat on the floor, dazed and heartbroken, with her wet body in his lap, holding her arms like he was playing with a doll. When the paramedics had taken her away, he sat down on the couch for a while, red, empty eyes. Then he had put his neurocaster on and leaned back into the cushions. This feels like the crux of the neurocaster's power, aside from its ability to seemingly defy death in its users. Mode 6 and the neurocaster unit clearly tap into a euphoric mental state, one that removes you from the pain and trauma of life in the electric state. The parts of the US we encounter are either in the midst of civilian exodus or full capture by Mode 6 and its wandering behemoths. More on those later. However, the infrastructure we see is still very much suggestive of a free market USA, with talk of a school system, a multitude of shops and restaurants, and essentially a sort of roughly equivocal lifestyle with that of today's US in our world. What does that say about life in the US, I wonder, that the Mode 6 form of escapism is deemed not only desirable, but near enough irresistible to a vast proportion of the populace? Certainly, the neurocaster's greatest offering would appear to be a form of collective social interaction unlike any we have experienced before. A collective experience that is juxtaposed against the neoliberal emphasis of the individual as championed by Thatcher and Reagan. In other words, a case of we versus me. In this next section, we're going to explore how the world of the electric state led to the Mode 6 revolution, and perhaps examine the parallels with our own world.
When we rounded a bend, we saw that the lines shot out of a massive spherical building rising from the woods on the side of the mountain. Steam and water poured out between the ragged tree trunks, forming streams that ran down the wooded slope and across the road. Someone should really heave those installations from their foundations and let them roll down the mountains into the suburbs, where they could crush whatever was left of all the gardens, houses, and responsible mothers and fathers in their SUVs, and finally lay themselves calmly to rest in the abandoned city centres as memorials to humankind.
We have already touched on how this version of the USA, with its adherence to free market capitalist ideology, has potentially led to a society of unfulfilled and alienated civilians, and how easy that made it for Centric and its Mode 6 neurocasters to offer an out that proved more appealing than what is charitably referred to as real life. Now, I have deliberately not looked into Stahlenhag's personal politics, but I do sense at least some cynicism towards the more gaudy manifestations of capitalism and its more obvious visual elements. A commonality of many environments in the electric state is the presence of advertisements, whether it be as part of the world that is, or part of the world that was. We see examples of Centre's aggressive media campaigns around the time of the Mode 6 release, for example. Even as the country appears to be falling apart, these huge monuments to capitalism haunt the landscape, offering glimpses of the environment that made up normal life before the events of the electric state. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, the lefty doesn't like adverts, we get it. However, I think it's important that we try to understand the material conditions and lifestyle that led to so many flocking to Mode 6 as a means of escaping. The Neurocast network clearly required a huge infrastructure, which led to many huge buildings acting as both network hubs and a sort of complex pylon. And it is these massive structures that seem to lend themselves to the neon glow of capital's advertising spend. The skyline is dominated by these gaudy and invasive structures that tower over the homes of ordinary towns and cities, as per this striking image. Good thing we don't do that in real life, eh? The spread of cables and the infrastructure required to feed the expanding industry of neurocasting seems all-encompassing, whether in small towns, cities, or the countryside, and the horizon exists as a reminder that the world is being consumed to feed the capitalist need for growth. More, always more, is the mantra as the tendrils and tentacles of this network spread from home to home, infecting each household like a disease. And it is not hard to understand how those who had not yet succumbed to the allure of Mode 6 would be tempted to try it, both as an inevitability they will have to face at some point, and as a way to escape the grey, ad-ridden hellscape that is spreading all around them. There are also other signifiers for how bad things had got in the good old US of A, in the forms of the walking adverts known as drones, and in the roadside wrecks that show us dark glimpses of how people were being exploited at every possible step, such as with this little gem. The motif of corporate and capitalist involvement in a lot of Stahlenhag's work seems to be portrayed in a cartoony, almost Cuphead-like 40s style, perhaps understanding that the wolf in sheep's clothing approach is one well trodden in our own world. Much as now, this version of the US appears to offer very little in the way of state support, and this grinning menace offering what I will assume is an opportunity to trade assets for financial support in times of declining health, feels like a snapshot of life as it was, and perhaps is today in our world. This cartoon style is found in many inappropriate settings throughout the Electric State, whether on the huge wrecked assault ships of the Civil War, the vast menacing corporate structures looming over roadsides, or the rotting vestiges of walking advert drones not yet salvaged or adopted by the Convergence movement. More on them later. You simply cannot escape the smiling face of commerce, and there is something to this deliberate design choice, the smiling but sinister, the friendly but insidious, and the way that the Neurocasters and Mode 6 eventually ended up creating the conditions for mankind's downfall. This reality does seem to be seeping in the minds of the few who remain beyond the grasp of the Neurocasters' call, as described by our protagonist Michelle. The town was emptying out. There were heavily loaded cars everywhere. Beds, couches and large TVs were carried out and lashed to trailers and car roofs. The supermarkets were chaotic and crowded, and the shelves were mostly empty. The long lines of shoppers shivered with anxiety and apprehension, people glancing at one another like they were waiting for looting to break out. Where is the state in all this, you might well wonder? Surely the police and armed forces should be making themselves seen in order to restore some semblance of control to a country that is rapidly falling apart. Well, unfortunately, it would appear that the military had largely been supplanted by the drone divisions and neurolinked pilots, meaning they were probably incapacitated early on. The war had been fought and won by drone pilots, men and women in control rooms far from the battlefields, where unmanned machines fought each other in a strategy game played over 7 years. Pilots of the Federal Army had lived a good life in brand new suburbs where they could choose from 30 kinds of cereal on their way home from work. The drone technology was praised because it spared us meaningless loss of life. A neoliberal government would take no time in sacking off the manpower of a traditional army if they were able to use a cheaper, much smaller pool of labour to achieve the same result, meaning that when the truly existential threat revealed itself to be the Neurocaster technology, there would be little means to roll out a manpower-based response. There are a couple of times police are mentioned during the Electric State, but they are seemingly no less affected by the call of the Mode 6 than anyone else. Right outside the town, 2 police cars were parked across the road. A roadblock. I sat paralysed and squeezed the wheel hard. After I slammed the brakes, the car's keys swung back and forth in the ignition, ticking like the hands of an old clock. I couldn't take my eyes off the police cars, and I waited for a crackling voice from a loudspeaker to start yelling at us any second. I was convinced it was all over, and that I would never see Skip again. I would rot away in a cell in some forgotten police station after all the officers in Pacifica had abandoned their posts for one reason or another. But it didn't happen. When I came up to the roadblock, the cars were empty and something was lying on the asphalt. A gun and something that looked like spilled nickels. Empty shell casings. Between the cops that had succumbed to Mode 6 and those battling the chaos enveloping the nation, it seemed there was little left in the way of law and order. What had they been shooting at, I wonder? Well, we do see one other person that kind of looks like a cop, and well, yeah, we will cover that more in a couple of chapters' time. But first, we need to talk about another theme that keeps popping up.
The drone technology was praised because it spared us meaningless loss of life. The collateral damage was of two kinds. The civilians unfortunate enough to be caught in the crossfire, and the children of the federal pilots who, as a concession to the godheads of defence technology, were all stillborn.
Another recurring feature of Stahlenhag's work is childhood, and by extension, how children are often failed by society. Whether in the divorce epidemics of Tales from the Loop or the forgotten teens of Things from the Flood, we see a lot of instances of the young being neglected, ignored or forgotten. And sometimes this would be literal, and sometimes it would be figurative, such as in Pontus's Carter, and the abandoned sentient machines left to rot in huge pits. The very first entry in the electric state is that quoted at the start of this section, talking as it does of how federal drone pilots experienced a substantial number of stillborn children as a result of their military endeavours. We later discover this may have been related to the Convergence, a topic I will cover next, but firstly I want us to just think about that for a second. About how the military, who was celebrated for coming up with a way of reducing deaths in war by using these drones, effectively transferred the burden of death onto those least responsible for the conflict, as per the quote at the start of the chapter. Michelle, our protagonist, had parents who both featured in the war, with their mother at least a drone pilot. Once upon a time, these kinds of ships had been the pride of the Federal Army, and they had been lined up on the runways where their captains had shaken the hands of presidents before thousands of spectators. Now here they were, plucked out of the sky, hollowed out and chewed up by the sea, and finally back in service as cliffs for birds to roost on. Behold the Amphion, the pride of the Air Force, 10 million tons of rust and bird shit. It was the neuronics in the Amphion ships that had burned out my mother's mind, so I guess it was fitting in a way. Michelle's mother seems to have been left a shell by her work for the military, and this made her a less than adequate parent, whose grasp on reality seems to have been slipping for a few years before finally giving out when our protagonist was still very young. I had lived in 3 different towns and attended 4 different schools by the time I started 5th grade. I had friends now and then. It depended on how my mother was feeling and where we could park our RV. When the others went home to their families and their pep rallies and ice rinks and jamborees, I was busy helping my mother ingest the chemicals her body and country no longer supplied her with. After their mother loses their job at the Air Force, they also lose all medical assistance, and Michelle has to learn how to help care for their younger brother, Chris, also known as Skip, who it is revealed has additional needs. When Skip is just 6, Michelle tells us this: I found my mother unconscious on the floor of the RV. I walked 3 miles along the highway holding Skip's hand until we found help. She died a year later at the hospital in Hobbs. Social services took Skip away and I ended up at my grandfather's in Kingston. Things seemed to improve for a short while, with Michelle's grandfather acting as a fairly effective and caring parent, though seemingly not enough for them to have also been granted guardianship of Skip. Unfortunately, the grandfather doesn't last too much longer, largely as a result of their having worked in the shipyards, with many such ex-workers suffering from lung-related ailments caused by the huge smokestacks on site. It is perhaps telling that Michelle's mother, grandfather and presumably father all died of work-related means, which is another interesting choice by Stahlenhag, as these all hint at class-related deaths. After the sad passing of their grandfather, Michelle goes on to live with a foster family, namely Birgit and Ted. Birgit and Ted seem like decent folk, albeit maybe a tad conservative for Michelle's tastes, and there is some conflict between the traumatised teen and her new authority figures, but it mostly seems like normal fare, all things considered. Burgett does make several comments about how addicts lacked the capacity for self-respect and responsibility, which seems a bit of a harsh choice of words given the circumstances surrounding Michelle's mother. However, as Mode 6 begins to take off, Michelle notes that their behaviour starts to change and their priorities move away from their foster child. It was after the big update of 1996 that things got weird. Mode 6. After that they rarely watched TV anymore. The house was quieter. I remember that sometimes when Amanda and I came home from school, Ted and Burgett were still on the couch in the living room with their Neurocasters on. They were completely out of it, and one night we amused ourselves by dressing them up. Amanda painted a mustache on Burgett. Eventually, as with so many others, their preoccupation becomes an obsession that leads to both Burgett's death, as we covered earlier, and to what amounts to Ted's abandonment of Michelle via the Neurocaster, as detailed here when Michelle is visited by the priest father of their girlfriend. He asked if he could talk to one of the adults in the household, and I showed him into our living room. This was after Burgett's death, and Ted was sitting on the couch, wearing the Neurocaster completely naked. This time I hadn't even bothered to cover him up when I came home from school. The Reverend turned to me and said that maybe it was better if he talked to me instead. Once again, our protagonist is left alone to fend for themselves, and this cycle of abandonment is played out on many levels throughout the book, and this course continues until Ted eventually checks out permanently. Ted has been down on the riverbank for a week. He was sprawled beneath a beach umbrella, and when we left Surst in his old Corolla, the vultures had already eaten most of his body, but below the horn of the Neurocaster his mouth was still moving, like he was dreaming. It was only the arrival of Chris, aka Skip, that stops Michelle from doing something drastic herself. I hadn't eaten in days. Not that there wasn't any food, the pantry was full of canned food and old pasta, but I think I'd decided to die. I can't really remember, but I do believe that's what I'd planned to do. I don't know how Skip found the Kid Cosmo drone, or me for that matter, but when that yellow robot stood there on the driveway with the toy cradled in its arms, the same toy I had given my brother 9 years earlier, I understood immediately. Indeed, the whole story is about siblings reconnecting and providing familial support after the adults in their lives have either died or abdicated their responsibilities. This thematic element is there in the stories of those stillborn children, who we are told are a concession to the godheads of defense technology. It is certainly there in the repeated failures of the protagonist's guardians, and it is borne out in small glimpses of the other lives we encounter on their journey. For example, we encounter a child at a supply stop later on, who is similarly paying the price for their parents' choices. I sat by myself for a while outside a burger box and ate a piece of apple pie. The patio was empty and quiet, apart from a boy bouncing dejectedly up and down in a yellow inflatable castle outside the entrance. I noticed he had peed himself, a dark stain stretching down one leg of his pants all the way to his shoe. He saw me, and our eyes met. He grinned, with more teeth missing than was normal. "Jump with me," he yelled. I looked around. We were all alone. "Where are your mum and dad?" "Everywhere," the boy replied. Now, in ordinary circumstances, such an answer, "everywhere," might indicate they have been vaporized, exploded, or otherwise physically spread around by a large amount of force. But then this is not an ordinary circumstance. The parents, like many others, have embraced the Mode 6 lifestyle, and are now connected to millions of others, but in doing so have abandoned their child. We also come across a chihuahua that is seemingly abandoned in a similar fashion. A dog stood between two tree trunks, a lonely little white chihuahua. It was wearing a tiny coat and was trembling and looking at us with its ears pointing straight up. The last thread I wanted to pull at, and which is at least partially fitting into this section, is to do with our protagonist's sexuality and the way that they are treated by the adults they encounter. We discover via several recollections by Michelle that one of the ways that they had dealt with the various traumas of their early life is through their connection with a kindred spirit called Amanda. I ended up at Summerglade, where I met Amanda, She was in my class at Riverside and had earned her place at Summerglade by attacking her chemistry teacher with a stun gun. Their relationship develops into a fairly wholesome teen romance and one of mutual dependence and love. We rolled our eyes through classes and skipped school and trespassed on private property and stole clothes and records together, and all of a sudden I didn't want to run away from Thirst anymore. I don't think it is overstating things to say it is one of the few solid foundations in young Michelle's formative years, but we quickly discover that this relationship comes under pressure from the older generations. Foster mum Birgit is never explicitly stated as being against Michelle's relationship with Amanda, but there are comments that suggest a traditional approach to appearance that indicates a conservative outlook. When Birgit went to order food, I told Ted I wanted to dye my hair black, and Ted told me how he had long hair in the 60s, and we talked about how the Beatles had influenced Kurt Cobain, and when Birgit came back with our food, Ted said, "Do you think Michelle would look good with black hair?" And Birgit chuckled, "Oh no, sweetheart, you really must take better care of your appearance." Eventually we learn that Amanda is moved away by their parents, who disapprove of their relationship with Michelle, and is sent off to stay with relatives, both to distance them from Michelle and to do some pray the gay away type religious nonsense. We discover more about this when Amanda's dad, the priest, came to visit Michelle. I asked him about Amanda. A smile of divine blessing spread across Father Ernest Henry's face, and he replied that Amanda's aunt and uncle had helped her find her way back to God, and that it warmed his heart that she was still in my thoughts. The bigotry and need for conformity of the older generations rips one of Michelle's core supports from their life, and uproots Amanda's at the same time in an attempt to brainwash the woman into behaving against their own instincts. There is a sad last mention of Amanda when they met up again sometime later, with the brainwashing appearing to have taken hold. Young happiness destroyed, all in order to fit a young person into the grey homogeneity of previous generations. Michelle, you have to wake up. It was all a dream. A game. Jim and Barbara have made me realise that now. We were just playing. And that's okay. It was all pretend. Amanda was standing by the side of the bed, and I took her hand and pressed her fingers against my lips. She pulled her hand away. I slid down to the floor and buried my face against her pant leg. What have they done to you? The persecution of the LGBTQ+ community is often spearheaded by older, more conservative demographics, using religious grounds as justification for open bigotry, and I do see this as a further example of how the future is being restricted, oppressed, and ultimately sacrificed in order to maintain the status quo as desired by those wielding power. Yet, power dynamics plays a part here too. Stahlenhag shows us repeated examples of the present sacrificing the future, whether on the personal scale or the national one. Whether it is the destruction of a nation by war and the persistent neglect of climate change, the oppression of LGBTQ+ individuals to fit an outdated concept of the American ideal, or an individual child whose life is torn asunder by their parents' addiction. Is Stahlenhag critiquing the neoliberal tendency towards generational wealth hoarding, the lack of action on climate change, or the escalating stakes of the culture war that the US is spearheading? Maybe. Maybe not. But certainly there is an awful lot to think about when it comes to how we treat the generations that come after us, and how such generational trauma might play out in the future.
What we're doing isn't civilized. I know that. But I know it must have happened to you too. Like me, you must have woken up one day and suddenly realized the inevitable. We no longer live in civilized times.
We've spoken a lot about the impact of Mode 6 and the Neurocasters on the world, but we haven't spoken too much about what is happening on the other side of the Neurocaster screen. That is largely because our main protagonist, Michelle, is unable to use the technology and is therefore unable to relay that experience to us. I told him I couldn't use them, that the doctors said it was because of a congenital neurological condition that made one of my pupils larger than the other, and that also seemed to make it impossible for me to use neuronics. It was just black. Nothing happened. Therefore, most of our understanding of neurocasting comes from observing its impact on the physical world, or from the opinions of others. Amanda's father, the priest, has this viewpoint. He suspected that there was some sort of signal coming through on the neurographic network that made people sick and destroyed their will and turned them into slaves. This chimes with this unattributed quote from early on in the book. Lighthouse keepers were once warned they shouldn't listen to the sea too long. Likewise, you could hear voices in the static and lose your mind. It was as if there was a code in there. A code that could, as soon as your mind detected it, irrevocably conjure demons from the depths. Father Ernest developed this thought process further. The Reverend believed this signal was Satan, and that Satan was luring people away from the path of God through the neurocasters, and in doing so was paving the way for the coming apocalypse. A rare win in the predictive game for the church there then. And there may be a seed of truth in it, as there does appear to be some sort of agenda behind all this, though it is perhaps not as simple as good and evil. Throughout the book, Michelle's story is interspersed with these black pages that talk from a different character's perspective, mostly looking back at what had happened and that had led to the current situation. This perspective comes to us via communications sent to a government agent called Walter, and it is through these briefings and updates that we learn of the Convergence. If the human intellect forms in the interaction among 100 billion brain cells, what would happen if you connected them to a few 100 billion more? Would it be possible on a neuronic level to link 2 or more brains? If so, what type of consciousness could emerge from such a vastly bigger neural matrix? There are those who believe that such a hive mind took shape inside the military neurograph network during the war as a side effect of an unbelievable number of nerve cells linked to one another. An intercerebral intelligence, they call it. These philosophical musings feel increasingly relevant to us in a world that seems determined to integrate technology and humanity as much as possible until the lines between organic and digital are fully blurred. However, all of the tech bro wet dreams in our world tend to assume that the commencement of such a relationship will be at our insistence. Stahlenhag instead asks us to consider, what if the technology itself instigates such a connection, thereby seizing the power of control? Walter's handler continues to explain the inherent danger of such an event. The same people also believe that this higher consciousness is trying to take physical form by influencing the reproductive cycles of the drone pilots. In that case, it was responsible for all the stillbirths during the war. They call themselves the Convergence. I would probably have dismissed them as yet another New Age techno cult if I hadn't seen what I saw moving across the snow on Charlton Island 17 years ago. Oh, that's a wickedly compelling final line, isn't it? Don't worry, we will come back to that later. So we have this literal meeting of the minds during the Civil War, where all these drone pilots were connected up via neurocasters, and some conglomeration of these minds began to identify a desire to exist in a new form, as a sort of intellectual collective consciousness. Does the individual cease to exist once it enters such a collective, I wonder? Would I stop being a me and instead just become us? And does this collective seize your mind and capture you, as suggested by Father Ernest and in that opening quote? Or is it more of a case of the collective state being such an alluring one that it draws people in voluntarily? This we are unable to answer, given that our only perspective on it comes from those who are ideologically against the Convergence, and Stahlenhag is quite a big fan of the unreliable narrator trope. This dynamic works for us, especially with what we know was still a capitalist US state, and given the USA's propensity for Reds under the bed McCarthyism whenever there is any kind of threat to individualistic consumptive culture. The US state would no doubt see the Convergence as an existential threat by its very nature, given that it is not only collectivism made flesh, sort of, but it also reduces physical productivity and reduces physical consumption to a minimum. I suppose what I'm getting at is that if people were able to have a healthy relationship with the Convergence and weren't all dying due to physical neglect back in the real world, I think the US state would be just as vociferously against its existence. As things stand, there are some more sinister elements to the Convergence that feed into the more devilish assertions made about its intentions. Walter's handler has already explained how it is hypothesized that the early form of the Convergence attempted to manifest itself in a physical form, using the pilots it was linked to during the war, though it seemingly didn't succeed as none of these pilots were ever able to come to term. However, there are some big old exceptions to that, aren't there? Firstly, we have the mention of something that was found crawling on the snow of Charlton Island in Walter's handler's first page. Later on we learn a bit more about this situation, as it is a wonderfully compelling dark tale and, well, it all gets a bit John Carpenter.
I still dream about it. It was the last winter of the war. We were supposed to repair the equipment at the airbase on Charlton Island in the Hudson Bay. Apparently they'd lost contact with the base, and since it was winter it was simply assumed that they'd had some issues with the weather. I don't know how to describe it. It was as if they'd all been transformed into termites or something. I mean, the things they had built, there was nothing human about it, if you understand what I mean. No human intellect could have come up with that and made it move like that. And the smell, it was the worst in the cafeteria. All the tables and chairs were stacked against the walls, and in the middle of the room there were a number of dumpsters where they'd put them. The children. The stillborn. Like I said, I still dream about it.
It's worth pointing out at this stage that this whole theme could have quite easily fitted into the Sacrificing the Future section, as the Convergence's attempts at birthing an organic heir and the amount of death it created in doing so certainly continues the theme of the young being sacrificed to suit the agendas of others. Even when the Convergence appears to have been able to create some form of life, however twisted and strange, the response to it is the same.
Something moved out there in the snow, far out on the white expanse. It heaved itself across the snow crust in a motion that was impossible to fathom. We burned it, we burned everything. Not a single one of the 150 people stationed at the base survived more than a few hours after we removed their neurocasters. So when the Convergence talk about their intercerebral divinity and how it tried to take physical form during the war, I'm not going to say they were completely wrong. What I saw at Charlton Island was not what I would describe as divine, but it definitely wasn't human.
We never get a good description of the creation they killed on Charlton Island. Was it organic, mechanical, or some mixture of both? It doesn't sound like the outcome was what the Convergence intended, and there seems little doubt it was destroyed before it could propagate itself any further. But wait, I did mention more than one exception, didn't I? The Convergence believe that this super intellect actually managed to create at least one successful pregnancy during the war, and that this child carried within itself a perfect, non-human genome, that it is the duty of the Convergence to breed and spread. What you believe about all this doesn't matter. The only thing you need to care about is that the Convergence has a ton of money and that the boy is valuable to them. The boy? What boy? Over the course of the Electric State, we discover that Michelle has a little brother named Chris. As Michelle recalls, something was wrong with him. They knew that right away, something about his brain, and before he was 3, he'd gone through more than 30 surgeries. When I was about 7, my mother was fired from the Air Force and the assistants went away, and it was my grandfather who had to teach me how to change Christopher's diapers and dress him and what he should eat and how I should feed him. It was my grandfather who started calling him Skip. Whoosh! Once we get that little nugget, we begin to understand why Michelle is so protective of her little robot companion. It is being piloted by her younger brother. But why would Walter and the government be interested in Skip? Well, it would seem the state believes that the Convergence has successfully created an organic child via the Neurocaster network and its human supplicants, and as Michelle tells us, Christopher was born when I was 4 on October the 12th, 1982. My mother always said that Christopher didn't have a father, so I guess he's my half-brother. Hold the bloody phone. So Chris, aka Skip, might be the first and only organic offspring of a giant mega intellect that is slowly swallowing the minds of modern America. That might be why, in Walter's storyline, they are in pursuit of Michelle and in search of Skip's human body. Walter plans to kill them before they can manifest whatever the Convergence has in mind, as per this from a later entry, as their handler reminds them. What we're doing isn't civilized, I know that. But I know it must have happened to you too. Like me, you must have woken up one day and suddenly realized the inevitable. We no longer live in civilized times. You're almost upon them, Walter. It's almost over. All this time, Skip has been guiding Michelle to find their human body so they can escape together, whilst at the same time both the Convergence and the government are seeking them out. In fact, there are several encounters that suggest the many unmanned mechanical drones wandering the lands know exactly who Michelle and Skip are, whether it be in the gigantic drones that completely ignore them as they travel, or the creepy looking drone that waves at them as they pass this barn in their car. Or even the gigantic demon clown drone that hides outside of the house where Skip's human body is, and fucking straight up splats Walter when he arrives to kill Michelle and Skip in this amazing sequence of pictures. Michelle is blissfully unaware of the unfolding drama outside. Beyond this, something shook the house with a series of deep, hollow concussions. Something massive was moving around out there, and flakes of paint and plaster rained down over us. I closed my eyes and waited for the roof to cave in. One final massive shockwave crashed through the house and something made of glass shattered against the floor somewhere. Then the house was quiet. And then the coast would appear to be clear. How should we feel about this though? Obviously we are very attached to Michelle and Skip at this stage, but they do now appear to be part of the Convergence's drive for expansion into the physical world, even if as unaware or unwilling participants. Things seem to be coming to a head in the United States, and this is spelled out to Walter in one of the last communiques they receive, before they got splattered by a giant demon clown robot. This might be our last chance, so if any of this bothers you, remind yourself that the ground has started moving beneath us. Remind yourself that the streets might be impassable soon, and any chance that has ever been within our reach will be gone. These sentences can be seen as a simple metaphor, but I think they are actually also very literal in the context of what is happening in the world. Whilst there have been several sightings of customised drones throughout the book, they are largely the work of people that have commandeered old military drones for their own purposes, like for example this old military drone now flying the flag of the Free Californian Republic. However, there have also been multiple sightings of an altogether more chaotic kind of creature, such as these. Michelle has an ambivalent relationship with these drones, and they largely seem to treat Michelle and Skip as an irrelevance most of the time. Put together by humans, you could clearly see parts of drones, a leg, an arm, a laughing face, but they had something else, a complexity that I've never seen before. Thousands of cables and wires and plastic and steel and oil created an impenetrable organic mass, and these things weren't just randomly put together, but had clearly been built with purpose. And underneath the unfathomable surface, some heaving movement could be seen, almost like breathing. I was scared, but I also felt something else when that thing stepped out of the mist in front of our car. I can't think of a better word than awe. These creations seem to have been guided by a greater intellect, shaping these chaotic masses of old machinery, cables, and imbuing them with some approximation of life. They are built with purpose, moving around followed by flocks of Neurocaster-wearing people connected by cable. Later on, Michelle encounters what appears to be something similar growing out of the ground near Skip's home. In some yards, even more incomprehensible shapes rose straight out of the grass, restless, twisted giant fetuses eager to be born. This seems to suggest that the very Earth itself was now being used to generate more drones, using more organic elements perhaps than the earlier reclaimed machines that we've seen stalking around. Could this be what was meant when Walter's handler warned the ground has started moving beneath us? Certainly there feels to be an escalation in the Convergence's grip on the world, with its tendrils now beginning to reach into the world from the organic Earth itself. Is Skip aware of their part in this, I wonder? Are they in fact driving the whole thing, orchestrating every single element as some key pivot of the Convergence's hive mind? Is Michelle just being a means to an end, an organic protector being used to shepherd the downfall of humanity? And is that the desired end result of all this madness? Let us not forget that our understanding of the Convergence is that it is a shared consciousness, not an abstract or alien one. If it is indeed the communal intellects of thousands or millions, then is this merely another ideological civil war? Certainly, despite the physical damage suffered by neglected bodies in the real world, most of those linked to the Neurocaster network appear to be happy, and these wandering tentacled drones seem to be shepherding all of those it can find. Take this from Michelle's observations of the drone they find in Point Linden. In its wake, the citizens of Point Linden, hundreds of people linked together, the Neurocaster connected to the oily god in the mist, floated across the ground in front of the car, and they looked almost happy. Calm and peaceful, they moved past the car and formed a single group again behind us, and soon disappeared into the mist again. Indeed, the symbiotic relationship between these drones and their headseted flock is borne out nicely in this image of multiple drones ferrying their tethered companions across a body of water. We also see what equates to both another attempt by the Convergence to breed in the physical world and a form of collective sexual endeavour, when Michelle and Skip happen upon a parked people carrier entwined with cables and entirely surrounded by a huge drone and its attached herd of neurocasting people. A crowd of people stood on the other side of the parking lot, gathered around something huge. Neurocasters glittered everywhere. What they had gathered around appeared to be an enormous rebuilt drone, and the noise seemed to emanate from it. Bundles of cables poured out of its open head like the arms of an octopus, spilling down to the ground, where they slithered across the asphalt up and over a minivan and into the driver's seat. I could just make out something there. The pale torso of a naked woman. She was pressed against the glass, her eyes closed, her face twisted with passion. The woman in question seems a willing participant, and leaves shortly after this event. Perhaps they are part of the Convergence's supporters, but either way the relationship between the Convergence and people doesn't seem openly hostile in the main. The only time we see any violence from the drones is when Skip is threatened by Walter. So the question is, do we consider the Convergence to be a threat or just an alternative to the traditional way of life? We see multiple instances of people whose bodies should be dead, and yet the Neurocasters keep them alive somehow, long past the point where they should have died. Human death doesn't seem to be the goal, even if it is sometimes the side effect. Are the consciousnesses of its participants preserved in the shared ether, making their physical manifestations merely a redundant power source? Does the transition from organic consciousness to digital require a substantial upload time due to the less than perfect nature of what is after all a new tech, potentially meaning that the masses of castawares connected to those drones are merely sticking with it until they are fully uploaded? All speculation, of course. It might be as simple as the shared consciousness having become independent from its original contributors, using the addictive qualities of the Mode 6 to extract knowledge, power and control from those connected, whilst it seeks a way to manifest itself physically via Skip. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Certainly the former sounds more interesting to me, and as discussed earlier, makes more sense in light of a failing United States, still focused on preserving its free market capitalism and individualistic consumption in the face of an evolution away from selfishness. Whichever way we look at it, the Convergence asks us some interesting questions. If we all connected, even for just a moment, without pretense, without social norms, without ego, without borders and without language, what would we ask for? What manner of world would we create, I wonder? I doubt it would be the one we have, that's for sure. The Electric State is the story of a teenage girl and their brother trying to survive in a world racked by war, climate change, and the emergence of a new and somewhat threatening way of life. It is a story about loneliness, family, and about the alienation of the modern world. Is the Neurocaster in Mode 6 a critique of social media? The commercialization of online spaces? Addiction? The alienation of capitalist society? Possibly all, or none of these. But it does raise the question, why would so many forfeit their lives and responsibilities so readily to escape into the Neurocaster? I suppose this makes the assumption that there is a choice. And really, how we view the Convergence and the many weird and wonderful things now wandering the USA in the electric state is largely shaped by this question of consent. The fact that people do not appear immediately hooked, often becoming permanently attached to the Neurocaster only after multiple sessions, suggests that it has an allure, and a potentially addictive one at that, but it is ultimately still shaped around offering something that people can't get in their daily lives. The pull of community, of togetherness, and of all working towards one end seems to be tied with a euphoric feeling that feels reminiscent of the more romantic descriptions of narcotic explorations, with people eventually willing to completely abandon one reality to become part of another one. Once we learn that Chris, or Skip as we better know them, is the first of a new generation of being, part person, part something else, it changes the way that we interpret the story. Certainly, Skip doesn't seem mindless or without individual agency, working as they do to reach Michelle via their drone body and to bring them to their corporeal body. And this suggests Skip may have more influence than most whilst in the Neurocaster network. Does Skip have a great motive or agenda? Are they orchestrating the wider movement of the machine drones and their incessant marching across the country? Is Skip responsible for the death of Walter? And should we be celebrating the escapades of Michelle and Skip, or fearing instead what may come of their survival? Simon Stahlenhag seems to revel in ambiguity, which seems fitting given the way that the electric state ends. It is remarked several times throughout the book that removing a long-time user's caster without their consent results almost entirely in death. And Michelle worries about what will happen once they pull the plug on their brother, and with good reason, according to Walter's handler. Not a single one of the 150 people stationed at the base survived more than a few hours after we removed their Neurocaster. Michelle contemplates. I still haven't removed his Neurocaster. He's eating and keeps his food down, but I haven't found the courage to do it. Not yet. I can't stop thinking about Bridget and how she collapsed on the couch as soon as Ted removed her caster. Sooner or later I'll have to do it. The kayak can only hold 2 people, and the robot will break down and then I don't know what I'll do. No. Soon we have to go down to the beach, and then it has to be done. It will have to be tomorrow morning. I'll do it then. The plan, as indicated by the kayak you see strapped to their car throughout the book, is to leave the American shore once they find Skip's body, and the final series of images you get from Stahlenhag are these. Stahlenhag pretty much leaves it up to you how the story ends, both in terms of the fate of Michelle and Skip, and the wider potential ramifications for the world. Should we be happy that 2 young people who have suffered at the hands of their parental figures, the state and its chosen economic system, have seemingly found a way to escape the circumstances that have so far blighted their lives? Or should we mourn the dawn of a new age, where humanity abdicates reality in order to escape into a new form of existence, led by this miracle child and their world-shaping potential? Stahlenhag always asks more questions than they answer, but that is the value of art, in my opinion. Good art should always ask you questions. It should challenge you and make you re-evaluate assumptions. The electric state asks us, how far do we entrust technology with our future and our salvation? It asks us if we should really entrust the construction of this technology to organisations driven by profit, greed and lust for power. And it asks us whether the real horror lies in the unknown or in the mundane reality we have allowed ourselves to be trapped by. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'm really enjoying doing these videos on the books of Simon Stahlenhag, and The Electric State is easily my favourite of the three I have read so far. It is a dark and twisted tale, but I have enjoyed the tighter, more narrative approach to this one and the almost graphic novel quality to its storytelling. With a movie on the way, it will be interesting to see what Hollywood does with it, though I'm already a bit sceptical given some of the people involved. But the important thing with media you love is that it still exists even after potentially ham-fisted attempts at making a profitable movie out of it. And hey, it might be good, right? Anyway, I hope you've had a good time watching this. Please give it a like if you did and consider subscribing for my next Stahlenhag video based on The Labyrinth. For now, take care all, be good to each other, be kind, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.